Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super special show today. My guest today is Katie Wells from Wellness Mama. Katie wants to live in a world where laundry folds itself, moms get to wear the superhero costumes they've already earned, and our kids never have to deal with the health problems our world is currently facing. When she's not reading medical journals, Katie is creating new recipes or recording podcasts. You can find her somewhere outside in the sun with her husband and her 6 kids. I had so much fun with this interview. Tons of awesome information. Also, if you haven't already signed up for Health Effects, join me and some of the top minds in the health space teach you how to talk to your doctor, how to take your own health into your own hands, and become healthier than you've ever imagined. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone, super excited to be here with my friend Katie, the Wellness Mama. How are you?
I am so excited to chat today. I love talking to you. I can't wait.
Oh, I've gotten so many requests to have you on my show. But before we start our conversation, I want to ask you, Katie, the Wellness Mama, what is your hero story?
Gotcha. So I'll try to give you the somewhat short version so it doesn't take all day. But basically, I've kind of been the type that I've done everything early my whole life. Finished high school, early finished college at 19, and sort of had this kind of existential crisis of I had positioned myself for maybe a political career or a legal career and realized I didn't want to do that. So I had a degree in journalism and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And as fate and time and everything would have it, I ended up meeting my husband on a walk across the country. We walked from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. It took us 3 months and half of us were walking all night. I got heat stroke the first week, so I was walking the night shift a lot of that time. And in hindsight, it turns out that walking all night long is actually not so great for your adrenals. So we got married shortly after we had our first child. And that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Now knowing what I know, it's easy to look back and say, yeah, probably having dozens of rounds of antibiotics in the first 5 years of life for strep throat, that wasn't so great. And probably walking all night wasn't so great. And also probably being very type A and pushing myself so hard through high school and college to the detriment of sleep and eating and stress levels probably wasn't so great either. But the pregnancy was really what kind of kicked in all the original symptoms and started me on the path of trying to figure out what was wrong with me. So at the same time, my husband, who was an early tech adopter and in the marketing and SEO world, kept telling me I should start a blog because of my journalism background and writing was my passion and an outlet for me. And he was thinking logically I should write a political blog because that was more of my background. And to this day, I'm so grateful that that's not what I did. That would have been a whole different world, probably a lot more stress. But I did start using my journalism background to research what was wrong with me and to try to start finding answers. And at the same time, right after my son was born, I was sitting in a doctor's office waiting, as one often does, for a couple of hours for the doctor to see me. And I had read pretty much every magazine in the office. And I was reading Time magazine and flipping through, and this line like jumped out of the page at me. And it said that for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children would have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. And that was one of those like very rare lightning bolt moments in life for me. Just seeing what was happening with my own health and knowing something was wrong and knowing how that felt. And then reading that that was the future for my kids and for all the kids in their generation. And so that really ignited that passion in me to research and to figure out why and to sort of start changing those statistics. And I didn't know if it would be possible or what that road would look like, but that's when the journey began for me. And since then, it took me a process of 7 years and 8 doctors, or maybe it was 8 years and 7 doctors, to finally get a diagnosis from Dr. Alan Christensen, who we both know, and to discover that Hashimoto's was the root of a lot of what I was experiencing, and to start being able to undo that damage in my body. But side by side with that, for me, really from the beginning, and still very much my passion today, is just focusing on changing the statistics, because having been through these things myself, I cannot and will not make this something that all of our children have to face.
Who was your gateway health expert? How did you, where did you start your journey?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I've always been a data nerd, and with the background in journalism, I had access to a lot of like online publications and health journals. So I started there, and I still to this day, I read a lot of studies every day. I'm just fascinated by data and the research side. But from the more attainable lifestyle side, I had this whole journey through Dr. Kate Shanahan and deep nutrition. And that was an eye opener of just really starting to understand that what we eat actually really impacts our body. And I know for most people listening, that seems like such a no-brainer. Everybody gets that now, that what we eat affects our body. But I had been raised very much with the idea that it was kind of just about calories. And as long as you weren't gaining weight or you were in that ratio, then you were fine. And starting to understand kind of that idea that food that we eat and supplements and the environment, it's more of like a chemical messenger to the body. And it's much more than just calories. That was eye-opening for me, along with an obscure one, but Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Dr. Weston A. Price. That's not a health book a lot of people bring up, but around the same time, between pregnancies and Hashimoto's and things that now I can see were obvious nutrient deficiencies, I had developed a couple of cavities. And so I was researching, trying to figure out, why do cavities happen? Why do some people get them and why do others not? And that led me to that book and to understanding the whole internal connection between oral health and the body. And from there, being able to make the connection that if it can affect our teeth, then what about our skin? What about our guts? How are all of the different elements of our body affected by the inputs that we're putting into them? And how do we optimize those for better health? And then from there, I know some books that you've read as well. Gary Taubes has 2 amazing books that were really helpful. And then people who are now friends of mine, but back then I was just reading like Mark Sisson's blog, Mark Steely Apple, and learning about the kind of the evolutionary approach to medicine, and people like Rob Wolf and Chris Kresser. Those were some of my earlier influences. But I also realized for most moms, like, the science is my passion and it's great, but I don't think most moms actually care that much about reading medical journals on a daily basis. And so when I was writing, that was my focus, was try to take these complex concepts and make them simple baby steps, because I 100% believe that women and moms are some of the most powerful forces on this planet, but we're also the busiest. So we don't have time to read an encyclopedia to figure out what to do, but we can implement, and we will do anything for our children. So trying to make these broad concepts very simple and applicable in daily life was my early focus with Wellness Mama.
So many things that you've said, I was like smiling so hard, because you mentioned, these people that I used to read, now they're my friends, and I've had the same experience. You go to these conferences, and I remember the first time Chris Kresser, I was like getting closer to him and, trying to start a conversation. He turns around and he says, "Hey, Guillermo." And I was like, whoa, he knows my name. So that was really cool. But about moms and being superheroes, I have a saying that you heal mom, you heal the whole family. How can we, as health practitioners or as part of this huge health scene, how can we make that true? Because like you said, it is the most influential part of the family. If you can heal mom, if you can reach mom with this message, you can change the whole family. But moms are the busiest. How can we ensure that the information that we're giving moms, A, gets digested and implemented, and B, that is truthful? Because the last thing that we need is moms to not have a good source of information. What are some things that you implement in your life to make sure that the information you're reading, and it's difficult for you because you understand the science behind things, and you're going to a primary source, but how can we tell moms how to discern information to make sure that they're not implementing bad science or bad advice?
Ooh, that's such a great question. And I think it's somewhat a multifaceted answer because I think you're right that the tendency is, especially with moms out there researching this stuff because they either have a child struggling through something or they themselves are struggling through something, is to see all of these different approaches and to feel like they are all things that they need to add to a checklist. And then they get busier and busier and busier. And when you have a mom hit overwhelm and crack, the whole family suffers. And it's almost impossible to find that balance and that healing when the mom is exhausted and overwhelmed. So this was actually something I struggle with a lot, even in my own life, because I have 6 kids. I have 3 businesses that my husband and I run together. And just in the course of daily life, there's a lot going on. But from the research, I also know that some of the most important non-negotiables are often the ones that easily get pushed away. So the short answer is, for me, it's been a mixture of creating systems and organization that reduce the mental stress of all the things that actually do have to happen on a daily basis, but also looking back to my grandmother's generation, for instance, and realizing that just like our foods changed and it's gotten more complicated when it didn't have to, our lives have gotten so much more complicated in just a couple generations, and that so many things we think to be so important are actually not, and there's stresses that we're creating and adding on. So on a very simple, basic level, and whether you're a mom or not, this has been really instrumental in my life, was basically reverse engineering my calendar. So rather than figuring out all the things that, like the activities and all the stuff that can go onto a calendar, and then fitting things like family dinner, sleep, and self-care around that, I reversed it. So we, as a family, we made a list of the things that were the most important non-negotiables, both for our family life and also for health. So for us, these are things like sleep and family meal times. And statistics show that those are really, really important for children and how they feel like they fit in the family culture, and also for bonding, for digestion, and also just so many aspects of health. Us cooking together as a family and eating a nutrient-dense diet at that family meal and spending time together, that's such an important core part of our family life and also our health. And then things like self-care and relaxation and not overscheduling. So those 3 things go on our calendar first, and then everything else, whether it be homeschooling, travel, other commitments, activities, has to fit around that. And just shifting that focus and truly putting the most important things in the most important places has reduced our family stress level so much. And there's some practical small things I feel like can really help as well, like at dinner every night, since we're together and we don't accept any commitments that interrupt family dinner, we have the opportunity to ask our kids mindset questions that help both our stress level and their stress level. Things like, what are you grateful for today? And what hard questions did you ask today? And our favorite is, what did you fail at today? Because I think that's something our society's also lost, is that failure is an amazing gift. And that's when we learn. So reframing that with our kids and with ourselves, like, what did we try today that was a little bit past our ability levels, and how can we improve from that? And so just from a mindset standpoint, I always like to start there, because I think if you can change the mindset, you can actually deal with the same amount of things that you have to get done without falling into that stress and overwhelm pattern. And not to say that I'm perfect. I certainly have days where I actually do feel stress, but I would say 99% of the time I don't feel stress on a daily basis. And it goes back to the systems. The second part of that being that I think the majority of stress for moms, or a large part of it, is that we feel emotionally responsible for the entire burden of the family organization and running the family, whether it be keeping the finances and meal planning and taking care of the kids and getting them to activities and scheduling doctor's appointments, all of those things. Even if we have help with any of them, we still are taking on the mental responsibility for remembering them and making sure they happen. So I realized that systems actually give you freedom, not restraint. And so I created systems for when all those things would happen, such that when I'm not doing those things, I don't have to be stressed about them because I know it's their time. When I'm not doing laundry, I'm not worried about getting laundry done because I know there's a time when it's going to happen already. Same with homeschool, same with everything. That's just really reduced the mental stress, which gives me then more bandwidth to be able to focus on things we need to implement, whether it be health changes or more things with the kids in school or anything business related as well. Also for parents listening, I would offer advice that I got from my grandmother that has been a huge game changer for me, which is the idea of not doing anything for our children that they can do for themselves. So I see so many moms who, by all standards, they're amazing moms, but they are so stressed because they're doing all the laundry, all the dishes, all the cooking, taking care of their kids, helping them with homework. And to step back, it's hard because we don't ever want our kids to fail. But if we can shift that focus to learning and to failure even once in a while being a good thing, and letting kids take on as they're able things like their own laundry and helping cook meals and helping in the kitchen, make them feel like they're part of the family and that they're contributing, because they actually are. They're contributing something amazing. It gives them independence and autonomy as they start moving forward in life. It also takes stuff off of our plate so we can do the things like research what supplements we should maybe be taking or why we should be spending more time in the sun. So from a personal perspective, that's kind of been my approach. And then when it comes to finding truthful information, I think this is such an important point, because you're right. There's a lot of conflicting information out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And if anything, right now, all the research seems to be pointing toward that the answer is almost always varied and is personalized. So just because you find a study about one thing doesn't mean that that necessarily is actually applicable directly to you, or that that's going to be the answer for you. So the varied personalized aspect on genetics and environment and health history and all of these things. So unfortunately, I think this is the harder part to answer, in that there's no really one size fits all. And it does take some of us doing our own detective research, or working with practitioners like you or Dr. Christensen or other doctors that I've worked with who understand the alternative approach, they understand the holistic side of it, and who are up on the research. But the best I can get to an answer of that is just, when possible, make sure anything you're reading does cite their sources. And if you're curious, go back and look at those sources, because the mainstream media is super guilty of this. But finding one small line of study and turning it into this whole article that was actually not at all what the study said, but most people never go back and look at the study. So just vet your sources, make sure that they're being truthful, that they're actually explaining what's happening in the studies, or find a source that you trust to do that. That's something I've tried very hard over the years to do, is to make sure that I'm very accurate in anything that I'm explaining, and that I'm not jumping to conclusions or oversimplifying something. And certainly we can all make mistakes, but to find credible sources. And the second part would be absolutely work with a practitioner who knows what they're doing, because we have so many negative inputs bodies are facing, and health conditions are on the rise. And that was instrumental for me as well, not just trying to navigate it on my own, but realizing at some point I actually did need thyroid medication that I couldn't get myself without a doctor. And I needed a doctor to explain what amount to take and what lifestyle changes to make. So I think there's a complementarity there as well.
So many nuggets of information, and I don't have any kids. It's a decision, I've made a long time ago that I wasn't going to have kids. And I applaud you, for all the things that you're doing and how organized you are. Even when we were setting up this interview, it was pristine how it was organized, and how, the communication was amazing. I aspire to get to that level of organization, and I don't have kids, so I don't know how you do it. You probably have a clone or something, but so many different things that you mentioned. For example, when you said moms will do anything for their kids, and that is the truth. And I believe in my heart that when a baby's born, the doctor has the ability to say, "Hey, you need to breastfeed your kid." That is going to give your kid the best chance at being healthy over any other thing that you do for the next 6 months to a year. You can live in the city or you can live in the country. You can live, if you breastfeed the kid, it's going to save you money. It's going to help you with weight control. It's going to help you hormonally. It's going, give a list to all these things. Unfortunately, what I see over and over is that doctors give they give the permission to the mom to not have to breastfeed. They'll say, well, we have different formulas that can be okay, or and that drives me insane, because you are missing an opportunity to touch the life of a kid for the rest of their life. How can we, as as practitioners or health figures, convince practitioners that are listening, or even moms that are listening, that your actions, your health habits are going to influence the next generation. And it could be breastfeeding, or it could be, healthy eating. And which brings me to a second point. What do you tell moms or people that are listening to your show that it's okay to feed your kids regular food, not from the kids menu? I have this thing about abolishing all kids menus, because there's no such thing as kids food. It's human food, and everyone should eat the same thing. So, two-parter. How can we change the mind of practitioners and tell them that what we allow moms, what we with our prescriptions or with our recommendations, can influence the life of the kids forever. And it's not about convenience, because formula is convenient and breastfeeding is not. And then second, how, for moms that say, well, my kid wouldn't eat that, how did you get over those obstacles to make sure that your kids were eating, regular food?
So to address the first point about breastfeeding, both from the practitioner side and the mom's side, I'll start by saying I have tremendous empathy for this scenario, because I have breastfed all of my kids till at least a year and a half. And I actually don't like nursing babies at all. I don't like sitting still. I don't like having something touch me all the time. Like, I don't mind being pregnant. I don't mind birth. It's the nursing that really gets me. That's the hardest part of motherhood for me. So I just want to say, I see you. I understand it's not easy, and I get that. But also, it's, to me, like, it's the curse of when you know better, you have to do better. And I think there's a large education component, and undoing a lot of the misinformation that was there for many years. Because when formula was first widely available, the research at the time, doctors, I think a lot of them actually thought this is the same as breast milk, or even some thought it was even better because it was fortified. And now we have research showing that's not the case, and that there's a whole other world to, for instance, breast milk that we didn't know about, that there's all these living components and many species of bacteria and prebiotics that are actually feeding the gut and developing the gut bacteria for the whole entire life. Not to mention that early phase in life, when through birth and the bacterial transfer there, and then through the lactobacillus during nursing, that's actually the only and first really initial exposure to those types of bacteria that we get and that we need. And it's programming our genes, now that we understand the genetic and epigenetic aspect, that's programming our genes for our entire life. So it's easy to say the statistics about, we know that when a baby is breastfed, they have a lower risk of all these diseases and of obesity and of cardiovascular problems down the road. But you're right, that does fall on the mom. And so I think the point there is two-pronged. One is, we need to make sure that practitioners are educated, and not just by the companies that are creating the formula or creating the alternatives to the natural, but also making sure that moms are supported. Because having done this 6 times, it is a drain on the body, and it is exhausting, or it can be. And it also can be emotionally tough for people like me who don't actually like it at all. And so I think that answer there is making sure that moms are supported nutritionally, psychologically, and by a community, which is something we can all step up and do, both people like you from the practitioner side, helping to educate other practitioners and your patients, and those of us who are just in the community and are moms, in being that voice to others and saying, like, I get it, it's hard and it's not always fun, and can I bring you a meal, or what can I do? I think so many things in life go back to community, and that of all of the changes that we've seen in societally worldwide, actually, in the last few decades, the loss of true community, I think, is the most harmful. And I think long term, we're going to really see those effects, because, again, I'm a data nerd, but when you look at the statistics, having a solid community and really strong relationships in your life, it's more important than quitting smoking. It's more important than regular exercise. It's so vitally important to humans. Like, we know from the data that if a baby's not touched enough, for instance, they actually die. It's our community and our connection to other people is so important. And through our high-paced modern world with social media and technology, we've lost the actual human part of that connection. We still have this fake connection through technology, but we're not actually meeting our base human need for community. And so I think if all of us just made an effort, wherever our phase in life, whether we're parents or we're not, but to reach out and really prioritize strong relationships, whether that be like for us, family dinner, or whether that's really just making an effort in relationships in your own life, I think that alone could have a huge difference for the next generation and for all of us now. But to the second part of your question, as far as what about like current kids who are picky, or to call out maybe some people listening, adults who are picky, because I hear from just as many adults who won't eat certain foods as kids. I would say this, that we no longer have the luxury of just maintaining the status quo. We don't get to do everything in moderation like our grandparents or our great grandparents did, because in the last 3 decades alone, we've seen, for instance, the vast majority of all the plastic that has ever been created in the world has been created during that time. So our bodies are facing levels of endocrine disruptors in our groundwater, in our drinking water, in our environment that are completely unprecedented. And we haven't fully figured out how to handle that. Our bodies have not. Plus, we're seeing blue light all day long. We're not getting enough natural sunlight, which I know you've spoken a lot about. We're not getting enough time in nature, which has benefits across the board, from vitamin D to oxygen to beneficial bacteria from the soil. So we're not getting any of the positive inputs we've always gotten throughout history, and we're getting many, many, many more times the negative inputs. So unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of just doing everything in moderation and hoping it will turn out okay. And so that to me means we just have to take a more proactive approach, which again goes back to the whole, we have to make time for that and bandwidth, because we can't just keep adding things onto our plate all the time. But I think that it starts with educating our children if we have them, or if we're adults and we're picky, educating ourselves about what our bodies truly actually need and what foods those come from, and prioritizing things that are actually foods. Your point is 100%. I love it about let's get rid of kids' menus completely, because who decided that kids can only eat hamburgers, chicken nuggets, and pizza? That's ridiculous. And if you go to Europe, that's not the case at all. There's smaller plates of the same adult food, and the kids are eating chicken and spinach and asparagus and snails and whatever else, and they love it because they were never told that kids' food was chicken nuggets and pizza. And if we're training kids that that's what they're supposed to eat, they're going to become adults who think they don't like vegetables or who won't eat certain foods, mainly because they're scared of them. And if you want to talk psychologically, especially with kids, they will not actually die. They might try to convince you they will. They will not die from trying a food they don't like. They will also not die from missing one meal because they didn't like the food. They will, however, potentially have some major health consequences if they never eat vegetables in their life. So we need to shift the way we teach our kids and give them opportunities, like I said earlier, to fail even when it comes to eating things, and to realize that's not fatal. Because if you don't, you end up with an adult who's never eaten a cucumber and who is terrified of trying a cucumber because they don't actually know what it tastes like. Or maybe they had one bad experience really early in childhood, and now they're afraid to try it again. And if you talk to psychiatrists, for instance, we know that phobias are not created by a negative experience usually. They're created by a lack of an experience. So for instance, you don't get afraid of heights by being on something really high and being scared. You get afraid of heights by never having to be on something that was really high up that scared you a little and realize you would survive. So same thing with foods. You don't become picky from trying lots of foods. You become picky from not having to try lots of foods and then being convinced later that you can't. So I think it's just that subtle shift in mindset, and not buying into and not letting kids buy into that expectation that they only can eat some certain processed carby foods, when it turns out kids can digest all the vegetables that adults can digest.
So so many truth bombs on that one, because you can have that lack of experience, and I've never had anything green in my life, and thus I will never have it. I don't know how many people I've heard say, oh, I don't like white stuff on my food, or like I don't like mushrooms, or I don't like, and eventually, if you get that exposure, and it takes a couple of times, 3 or 4 times, then your palate changes, and then you can start accepting these things. And if anything, let's not even talk about like the benefits of eating a high variety of foods. If anything, it makes life fun to have all of these different things. My mom told me that I didn't like a lot of foods, and I grew up with a very small palate, of things that I would eat. And for some reason, my mom convinced me that I didn't like eggs, and that I didn't like tomatoes, and that it took me a while to for me to realize that maybe I did like them, and I started eating that stuff, and it was better. But the one thing that made me start trying other things was cooking and geeking out, watching Alton Brown and all of the different things that he did with food. It's what actually just expanded my tastes, and I started trying different things. Do you cook with your kids?
Absolutely. So I actually put them through an online course called Kids Cook Real Food, which is fun because even though they've been in the kitchen with me since they were babies, basically, this course is done by a teacher who takes them through the actual skill, like using a knife properly and what it means to saute and how do you boil something. And it's more fun for them because it's not just me teaching them all the time. And then so that plus they help me a lot. The result is that my older ones can absolutely cook an entire meal by themselves, which to your point is you're so spot on that even kids, if you cook something, you're more likely to eat it because you've invested time in it. And if we let our kids get adventurous in the kitchen, we may all have to eat a couple meals that maybe aren't so great while they're learning, but they're more likely to try them, and they're going to have this life skill of cooking for their whole entire lives. I'm the same way. I actually didn't know how to cook before I got married because I had been doing the whole academic thing my whole life and never really had prioritized learning like kitchen skills, for instance. And so I had to learn from scratch when I got married. And I also watched some of these chefs on TV and learned my basic skills that way. And I was determined that I didn't want my kids to have to wait till they were adults to figure out how to cook as well. So yeah, absolutely, we cook with them.
It's funny how many people don't know how to cook. I could be super tired. I could be, super busy. I could be, tons of deadlines. But I know that between my freezer and my fridge, I'm 5 minutes away, 10 minutes away from making a meal at home. I don't have to pick up my phone. I don't have to call it in. I don't have to, I know that because I'm prepared, because I have, a deep freezer, and I have, vegetables, and I have the spices that I need, I'm 10 minutes away from having a healthy food, a healthy meal, which brings me to this problem. What do you think about people that say, oh, eating healthy is very expensive? And to my point, I do have a Costco membership. So I buy in bulk, so that saves me money on certain things. I have I used to buy a gallon of coconut oil once every couple of months. Now I discovered that my lipids don't look so good with coconut oil, so now I buy olive oil in bulk. I keep some frozen veggies, which are not the best, but in case of an emergency, I always have vegetables. All of these systems, that you spoke about, cost money. And sometimes getting those systems in place, you have to spend a little money in order to be able to benefit from health. And in the end, it saves you money. If you think grass-fed beef is expensive, you can buy a quarter of a cow and save money. But that initial investment can be daunting for people that don't have the resources. So two-parter again, what do you say to people that tell you that, oh, eating healthy is expensive? And B, what are some tricks that you share with your audience, or you can share with us, about how to make things affordable in order for you to be able to eat and live this healthy lifestyle?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head as far as a couple of those. Like buying in bulk is always a great way to save, but you're right, it does take more of an upfront investment. I'd say also a lot of it goes back to mindset. So I'll get into some practical stuff in a minute, but I know a lot of people who complain about how expensive real food is, but they're willing to spend $5 on a latte from a coffee shop, but they're not willing to spend $5 on a dozen organic eggs. And so I think it is partially about our priorities. And for our family, that looks like with 8 of us, if we went out to eat for one meal, that's usually at least $70 to $100. And you can buy a tremendous amount of healthy food and make a lot more than one meal with that same amount of money. So we really prioritize, like you, cooking at home and realizing that when you do that, you save money across the board, and also shifting the focus to realize that when you prioritize your diet and healthy food, you also can save money in the long term on medical expenses. That's not an immediate shift, but realizing over time we get sick so much less often. The kids have strong bones, so even though they're jumping out of trees on a daily basis, they're not breaking their bones. Things like that really do pay off, and they're intangible and they're hard to see when you're making those switches, but they're absolutely there. And even things like we make a lot of our remedies, for instance, from scratch at home. So we'll make elderberry syrup in bulk, which is really inexpensive, and that helps us all stay well throughout the winter and save money on having to go to the doctor. But when it comes to just the food side, my go-to strategies typically involve, like you, buying things in bulk, and we make our food budget line a top priority. So it's one of our line items in our budget, and one that we make sure to prioritize even over things like family vacations or travel, though we still do those things as well. And I know when you were on my podcast, we talked about this, but the seasonality aspect is huge when it comes both to saving money and to getting the most nutrient dense foods, because things that are in season are also typically the most expensive, because the farmer's market or the store or wherever you're buying food has the most of those. So in the winter, that's things like cabbage and certain greens, and that's when we would eat more root vegetables. In the summer, it's things like squashes and cucumbers and tomatoes and things that are abundant, and developing relationships with farmers, both for things like meat. You mentioned buying a quarter of a cow, which is a great idea, and we've done that for years. But also for produce, you can often negotiate bulk rates with farmers. And so when cabbage is in season, for instance, I'll buy a whole bushel of it or a huge box of it, and we'll eat it fresh for a while because it lasts a long time in the fridge. We'll also make sauerkraut with it, which then is a source of probiotics. So it's just finding those ways and implementing them slowly. But over time, they make a big difference. And I think it is always it's a work in progress. All of us are. But I have like the few staple foods and go-to meals like you that are so easy, that can come together in 10 minutes or less, and that don't have to break the bank. And you're right, frozen veggies, especially if they're organic or if they're not on the dirty dozen list, they're not perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better than fast food. So if that's your baby step and that's your switch, then do that. That's awesome. Or back to the earlier point you made about convincing ourselves that we don't like something. I'll bust myself out on this one. For me, for years, it was sardines. I was convinced that I hated sardines because they were so nasty. And I eventually just resolved that I was going to train myself to like them, because they're basically like a multivitamin. They're inexpensive. They give you a lot of calcium and omega-3s and protein. And over time I did, and now I actually love them. And that's what I'll be eating for lunch today, is sardines with some mustard and a salad. And they're so nutrient dense and they're not expensive. They're so much cheaper than eating a meal out, or even just buying sandwich ingredients at the store. So I think it's just making those small shifts in priorities over time add up to huge differences in the long run.
I was just reading it was an art project actually, and it was this dude that wanted to create a sandwich, but he wanted to do everything. So from growing the sunflower seeds to create the oil for the mayonnaise that he was gonna make from raising chickens, milling the wheat to make so every single aspect of the sandwich. He ended up spending $1,600 for one sandwich. So making everything from scratch can be very expensive, but we are not paying $1,600 for a sandwich. We pay what $3, $4 if you go to your gas station, and it's because all of these products are created in bulk, and you're not having to press your own sunflower seeds, and that's how that $1,600 sandwich can be down priced to a couple of dollars. Same thing with eating healthy. Making your own sauerkraut. It's going to have live cultures. It's going to taste amazing, and you can make a bunch of jars, and you can trade with your family and friends. Maybe they made some almond butter, and maybe you can trade some kimchi for almond butter, or do some of that and do two things, where, kill two birds with one stone. You would be sharing family recipes or your own recipes, and you would be creating some community, which we talked earlier today, that is so important to have community. Now, you mentioned you not liking sardines. How did you train yourself to like them? Just like a little bit at a time, or what about liver? You like liver?
I don't love liver. I will eat it though, and I can make myself like it. I think with liver, the key for us is just adding a lot of spices, which also are really synergistic with the nutrients in the liver. So we'll add like a lot of cumin and turmeric and different spices on it, and then cook it in a pan with some olive oil and vegetables just to give it different flavors. But I think also a helpful shift, to answer your first question, with sardines, I eat a little bit at a time, realizing that all the literature says that if you eat something, it disagrees on the number, but anywhere from 10 to 25 times, your body will acclimate to it, especially if it's a healthy food. And so I kind of gave myself that wiggle room that I'm going to try this 25 times and then reevaluate. And I think about somewhere in the 16 times range, I realized I actually liked it, especially if I put like mustard or pickles or something that has a good complementary, strong flavor on it. That really helps. But another shift that I think is helpful, just a mental shift, is instead of thinking about the cost of food in general, like per pound or per amount, think about the cost per the nutrition value. So if you want to play that out, buying a hamburger at a fast food restaurant might cost like $1 on their dollar menu, but buying a can of sardines for just a little bit more than that is going to give you like 10 times the nutrient level. And so that was a helpful shift for me. And then we started implementing what are the most nutrient dense foods and looking at meals instead of just how can we get a volume of calories into our bodies to not be hungry. Yes, that's important too, but how during this meal can we optimize the amount of nutrients that we're consuming by still consuming the same volume of food? And then you focus on things like bone broth and sauerkraut, fermented foods. And also one I know Dr. Christensen likes to talk about is broccoli sprouts, which are really high in sulforaphane and a lot of nutrients. And if you buy broccoli seeds in bulk, again, on even somewhere like Amazon now, you can buy organic broccoli seeds and sprout them yourself. 1 tablespoon of broccoli seeds makes a quart-sized jar of sprouts, which can be added to omelets or salads or pretty much anything. And then you're getting much higher nutrient value per meal for really about the same cost. So that was a helpful shift for me, especially when we were on a really tight budget and trying to eat healthy, was shifting that focus of just how can I, on a budget, get the most nutrient dense things possible into each meal.
And that's the thing, people don't realize that we are overfed and undernourished, meaning that, yeah, $1 can get you a bunch of calories, but are those calories giving you any nutrition? Just think about this, we can do an exercise where I give you $10 and you can go into a gas station and see how can you get the most amount of calories with $10, and then do a second experiment where we can see how can you get the most amount of nutrients with $10 from a gas station. And it's going to look completely different because you can get, like a slice of pizza, you can get, a tub of ice cream, you can get maybe a couple of cans of soda, and that will give you a lot of calories. You could probably walk out of there with 7,000 calories for $10. But if you look at the micronutrient density, it's going to be very poor. It's going to be really high in things like sodium, and it's going to be really high in things like sugar, but it's going to be very low in micronutrients. And with those $10, you might get cans of sardines and a side salad, which is not going to equal the amount of calories, but that nutritional density is going to be through the roof. So there is a big difference between having calories and having nutrition. And that's why I don't agree that calories in, calories out is the only way to lose weight or, a good strategy for dieting. Not to say that calories are not important, but the story is way more complex than, garbage in, garbage out. You have to take into consideration nutritional density. You have to take into consideration macronutrient content, and you have to take into consideration calories. And the problem, to your point earlier today, is that we don't like the maybes. We don't like the, well, it depends. We want black and white fast rules. But in reality, life is dirty and life is complicated. And in order for us to be better human beings, we have to try to understand these complicated rules. And that's one of the beautiful things about your message and your blog, that you're showing us that it can be done even with a super busy lifestyle, with 6 kids, and with all of this information that you're putting out. And I heard a rumor that there's a new book that's coming out in December. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I'm so excited to share this one because I've written cookbooks in the past. And like we've talked about, I love cooking. I think you can accomplish a tremendous amount in your life by cooking. But the only negative reviews I ever got on the cookbook were people saying, why doesn't it include your other recipes for cleaning, for beauty, for natural remedies? And so the new book is called The Wellness Mama 5-Step Lifestyle Detox. And it includes all of that. So it's an approach of how do we naturally remove all of the negative components in our environmental life day to day, whether it be toxic cleaners that we encounter or all the things that are problematic in beauty products, or how do we address minor illnesses with natural remedies versus having to turn to medication. So it addresses all of that. Plus, it includes over 100 brand new recipes for all those types of products. So for homemade cosmetics and lotions and beauty products, and also for cleaners and for things like elderberry syrup and remedies, basically just keeping for a person, for a family, it's applicable to anyone. How do you switch to a more natural lifestyle in a sustainable way that won't break the bank?
I love botanical medicine. I did a lot of research on botanical medicine. Next time we get together, we need to geek out on that stuff, because I have so much information about extraction methods for different plants and dosing and, all of that stuff. I geek out on that stuff, because I think that giving people the power to make their own medicine, it's like a different level of like enlightenment. It's like, now you're Harry Potter and now you're defeating Voldemort, because being able to recognize a plant, process the plant, and then have the intention to turn that plant into medicine, it's just mind-blowing, and it's liberating, and it's awesome, because we have all these constraints and all these restraints against, being our own health advocates. And when you go from, okay, so I've read this book about what to eat, to now I'm making my own medicine, that's like a different enlightenment period.
Yeah, exactly. And it honors, I think, also like the generations of wisdom from previous generations and just throughout history of supporting the body and realizing that the body almost always is capable of working back to health. And that's the default of the body, is to want to be healthy, and that you can support it in doing that with natural remedies in a lot of cases. Of course, there's always a place for traditional medicine as well, but that you can support the body in its own recovery process versus having to take something that kind of counteracts that process or just treats one of the symptoms. And I think there's so much value, like you said, in going back to that approach of looking at the body holistically and realizing we can use so many amazing things from nature to bring the body back to health and to maintain health.
Katie, we're approaching this, the hour, and we could talk for 2 more hours, because you have insights that, unfortunately, I cannot give my listeners, because I don't have any kids, and I'm a guy, and I come to this space in a different way. But before we leave, did you have a sweet tooth before going in this health journey?
Good question. So not really, ironically. I was raised, my dad's entire family, they definitely had a sweet tooth. Every family activity, there was all the sugar. And I just never really loved sweets that much, but I always had the cravings for salt, which I think now, like I can see, actually was tied to probably micronutrient deficiencies and actually needing things. And probably the salt I was eating for my early life wasn't actually real salt. It was just sodium chloride, and it didn't have the nutrients I needed, but I always craved like the salty foods. So for me in high school and college, it was much more like the chips and salty things that I craved much more than the sweets. But thankfully, there are, just like with the sweets, there's some great natural substitutes. And now I can eat like seaweed chips or not chips, but like sheets of seaweed, or sardines are wonderfully salty, or anchovies, things like that. So I've learned to like pay attention to the underlying root of a craving versus having to turn to junk food.
Do you have any tips for anyone that has a monster sweet tooth? Because I don't, coming from that, I have no compassion. I'm like, just stop eating sweets. But that's not very good advice.
Partially, you have to realize that sugar is essentially, it's a chemical and it's essentially a drug. I know that there's a lot of debate about how much of a drug it is, and people like Dr. Mark Hyman saying it's 8 times as addictive as cocaine. Whether or not that's true, we do know that sugar affects the brain and it releases dopamine. So just like any substance that creates dopamine in the brain, the body has a tendency to want that more and to adapt to it. And the more you give, the more it wants. So it's created a positive feedback loop. So for breaking a sweet tooth, you have to understand that what you're dealing with is a strong substance and come at it with a strong response and realize that you have to break a physiological process in the body that's not just about willpower. That way you can put the tools in place to face the challenge without just feeling like you're failing when you give in. It's helpful to give yourself a complete break for anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, which is enough time for the brain to start to reset that pattern and that dopamine response. And then for some people, that it's easier to eat no sugar than moderate sugar, even when it comes to natural sweeteners. Some people, once they break that feedback loop, it's easier to stick to moderation. That's more of trying to figure out your own personalized aspect. But my go-to is to give yourself, if you can, a whole month without any kind of sweetener or sugar, even the non-sweet ones like stevia, that even though there's no insulin rise with stevia, it's still a sweet response. It's triggering that in the brain. So giving yourself a break, and at the same time, really trying to load up on all the nutrient-dense foods to actually satisfy what the body actually needs. And then after that time, gauging if you can reintroduce natural sweeteners in moderation at times, or if you should really just stick to fruit, which is great because it has all the components, the fiber and the polyphenols and all the things that it's supposed to have in combination with the natural sugars, and figuring out what time of day those work for you. So I know, like for instance, Dr. Christensen talks about having those in the evening to promote the right insulin and cortisol response. Those are the things to figure out on your own, but giving your body the break is so important for resetting that loop. And I have friends who, for them, they never could go back to it. So they don't even really eat much honey or maple syrup or anything like that, just because they've seen that feedback loop. And once it's so ingrained, it can be very, very difficult to ever go back to without it becoming a cycle again. But I think, unfortunately, it is one of those things when you realize that you're essentially facing a drug that you have to take a pretty strong approach to.
Again, you're just a wealth of information. Katie, where can people find you? How can, if you live under a rock and you've never heard of her blog, where can they go read? When is the book coming out? How can they get it, pre-order it?
So the book is available for pre-order anywhere that books are sold right now, Amazon, bookstores, anywhere. It's coming out in early December. And if everybody can find me and find more about anything we talked about on wellnessmama.com or by going to any podcast app and searching for the Wellness Mama podcast.
Thank you so much. Again, you are inspiring, and I have a Wellness Mama goals now. I want to have a budget line for my food and super amazing protocols so I can have my laundry done and not have to worry about it. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be here, and I really appreciate you having me on.